Evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting for the Tigard-Tualatin School District Budget Committee. I will call the meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. Are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes.
All right, with that, I will take a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
I move that we approve the agenda as presented.
A second.
Was that Beth? Okay. Oh, it was Joel. There's like new voices and many more. All right, motion was made by Vice Chair Jaime and seconded by Director Zerschmied. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I'll move to a choral vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Oh, it's like the little backup singers over on the sides sharing the mic. And I did skip over introducing new members. I was thinking it would come after we approve the agenda, but we do have a couple of new faces. So I just wanted to introduce Kelly Cameron and Beth Dittman. Welcome. We are very happy that you guys are here. And so with that, it is time to go into the election of officers for the Budget Committee. So at this time, I will take a nomination for the presiding officer.
I nominate Megan Medlem.
Would you be willing to accept?
I accept.
All right, and so this does not need a second, so we will now go to a roll call vote. I will start down with Beth.
Approve. Aye.
Jimmy?
Aye.
Debbie?
Aye.
Corey?
Aye.
Kelly? Aye. Megan?
Aye.
Kristen?
Aye.
Joe?
Aye.
All right, motion carries. Welcome to, hi Henry. Welcome. Megan has been nominated for presiding officer, and so we're doing a roll call vote. So would you like to add yours to the roll call?
Aye.
Aye with a slight question mark. All right. So at this point, I will be handing the gavel and the rest of the script over to you, and then you will then elect the vice chair. I'm off duty.
Okay, I'll now ask for nominations for a vice presiding officer.
Nominate Jimmy Brown.
Okay, and we'll do a roll call vote.
If he accepts.
Oh, do you accept?
Yes.
All right. So I'll do a roll call vote. Jimmy Brown,
Aye.
you're first on my list.
Aye.
I'll just go around the room. Beth,
Aye.
Henry,
Aye.
Jaime,
Aye.
Corey,
Aye.
and Tristan,
Aye.
and Kelly.
Aye.
Kristen,
Aye.
Joe.
Aye.
Oh, and I skipped. Okay. All right. Is that everyone? Okay. All right. So now we have the presentation of the budget message.
Good evening, Budget Committee members and Board of Directors. My name is, Jessica C., and I've been serving as the Chief Financial Officer for the district since July. I'm pleased to present the 25-26 budget message. And before jumping into the slides, I just want to give a quick overview of some of the handouts in your packet. That's all. I might be pulling them up or referring to a page. So you have a copy of the budget message, which was distributed along with a copy of the budget earlier this week. You also have the district's most up-to-date state school fund estimate, which is a two-sided document detailing enrollment as well as projected revenue figures. Later in our presentation, we'll look at a 3-year forecast pertaining to the general funds financial activity. And then finally, just for reference, we have a summary of all funds pertaining to the various funds comprising our budget. So with that, before we jump into the details, I just wanted to go over the charge of the budget committee. During our time together, you'll receive the official district budget message, which summarizes the proposed budget document that was distributed and posted to our district website on Monday. As applicable, this would be an opportunity after the presentation to hear comments from the public. And then there will be a time for the committee to deliberate or ask district leadership any questions about the proposed budget. And finally, at the end of the meeting, we would request that the committee consider approving the budget, the permanent local option tax rates, as well as levying taxes for general obligation bonded debt. As we jump into details about the budget, we'd just like to call attention to the responsibility of local governments to determine budgets based off of estimates made in good faith. So we know that budgets or reality and estimates sometimes don't align, but management has prepared the budget document based off of the best information that we have at this time, which is specifically important during a year where we have a long legislative session and the biennial budget is still going through the legislative process. Our presentation tonight will contain 3 different parts, just given the magnitude of the proposed budget reductions. We'll spend the first part of the presentation reviewing the general fund and the historical financial results. We'll also talk about enrollment and staffing, and then provide a current update on where the state school fund is currently funded. We will also spend time in part 2 talking about district leadership's approach to making the recommended budget reductions and how those changes will explicitly affect staffing and program offerings at the school district. And then finally, we'll close our time reviewing reserves and the district's financial outlook, and also spend some time discussing other funds. Okay, so as we, being new to the role at the district, I wanted to take some time to bridge some amounts and documents that the budget committee reviewed last year as they approved the 24-25 budget, as we also look ahead to the 25-26 year. The district has spent a considerable amount of time this year discussing the general fund with our community, at least during work sessions or board updates. We specifically entered this fiscal year with a missed revenue projection, which required us to implement a mid-year budget freeze. And so I just wanted to present some information that we've shared with the community about the district's general fund. So specifically, this timeline aligns with the COVID-19 pandemic, where with students not attending school in person, it allowed the district's general fund reserves to increase. So in 1920, that was the year students went home and spent about the last 10 weeks at home learning virtually. So we had facilities closed, which allowed our ending fund to be about 20%. 2021, students spent a majority of the year again learning virtually, returning to school under a hybrid model in the spring. Facilities were closed, and often just because of the nature of not being in person, any open positions also weren't filled, which allowed the operating or the general fund balance to increase. Concurrently, we also had federal pandemic relief that we were able to spend as an alternate to general fund dollars, which led to an all-time high of the general fund balance at the end of fiscal year 21 being $34.4 million, or 23%. Since then, as we responded to students' needs returning to school, the district conscientiously used federal funds in conjunction with reserve money to expand service level to meet students where they were. And so what you'll see in the years 21-22, 22-23, and 23-24, a consistent use of fund balance to maintain operations. And specifically, you'll see in 23-24, that was the first year that the approved ending fund balance actually went below the 12% required by fund policy DBDB. So the current year, again, under the approved budget, we're slated to end the year with an 8% ending fund balance. This consists of our typical 5% ending fund balance, 2% contingency, and then a 1% sustainability reserve. This graph is a different way to represent the same relationships between expenses exceeding revenue over the last 4 years. Specifically, 24-25 was the first year that we didn't have federal COVID relief money at our disposal. And so at least in the budget, we were expected to use $5.2 million in reserves. And so the black bar is just showing the use of reserves because that's the difference of expenses, which is unfortunately the middle line, and that's higher than the revenue line, which is denoted with the micro dots. And you'll see the total general fund budget is the top line, with this current year being $191.2 million. This is a document that my predecessor shared in his presentation last year, into showing that with the adoption of a 24-25 budget and certain revenue and expense estimates, that as entering the 25-26 school year at a minimum, the district would be looking at required reductions of $9 million. In addition to needing to make reductions totaling $9 million, it assumed a continued use of reserves of $2.7 million and an ending fund balance of 6%. Those trends would continue in 26-27 if not adjusted, with an additional $1.6 million of reserves used and the fund balance dropping to 5%. So again, this was just the forecast and the situation we were coming into during this fiscal year. As you've read in the budget document, the general fund is looking at a total reduction of $10.6 million, which is higher than the $9 million indicated. And there's a couple of things that have caused that to change. Oops. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, there, sorry about that. So if we look at revenue, there's actually some good news there. The governor's recommended budget was higher than what we had built into our forecast last year. Those amounts presented were based off an $11 billion state school fund, and the governor's recommended budget, which has been echoed by the co-chair's budget framework, is currently sitting at $11.36 billion. With expenditures, however, we've had some reality hasn't quite aligned with forecast. COLAs have been negotiated with our professional association groups at 4% for 25-26, or at least for 25-26, as well as 24-25. And the forecast at least assumed a 1% projection for 25-26 and 2% in 26-27. And then our initial PERS estimates included a 1.5% change in rate. And initially, our published finalized PERS rates ranged from 3% to 3.6%. I do want to highlight and emphasize that there's past legislation that will provide specifically school districts with PERS rate relief. So we have relied on that past legislation and used a partial estimate or a partial reduction in the rate in the figures that you're considering. So we're already relying on partial relief in the budget assumptions that we've presented. All right, so going back to some history, with the state school fund, we're largely funded based off of the number of students we serve, yet our largest expense is our staff, and those relationships have decorrelated since 1920. our current enrollment for 24-25 was 11,445 students. That's approximately 1,200 less than it was in 1920. Meanwhile, staffing has increased 14.5%, rising from 1,174 staff to 1,344. So as we talk about staffing and we look at the budget, and specifically when we focus on FTE numbers, I wanted to provide a high-level summary of the various budget messages that the districts presented, and also just provide more context for what happened after budget approval. All of this was allowed within the appropriations approved by the board for the school district, but it can kind of help provide some clarity about the extent to some of the proposed reductions. So for example, in the 22-23 budget document, the district indicated that it might use federal funds and general funds to hire an additional 22.7 staff. That was approved and, or it was approved per the budget and occurred. And also after the budget, an additional 29 staff were hired. So total fiscal FTE change for that year was 50 staff. When the 23-24 budget was prepared, the district noted that it would need to add 6.75 employees. This was specifically called out as being related to the opening of the Art Rutkin Elementary School. Each new site requires a custodian, a secretary, a principal to at a minimum. And so those additions were articulated. But the budget message also indicated that a reduction of 67 employees would need to occur. That was approved, and those reductions did occur, yet after, or as the school year progressed, 59 employees were hired back. So even though the budget message articulated 67 employees would be reduced, the net change for that fiscal year was an addition of 2. And that brings us to the 24-25 budget and the budget that we're working from. We indicated we would add 5 FTE. A majority of those were actually converting purchased services at the ESD through service credits to becoming TTSD employees because it was less expensive to do that, but it happened in different funds and it became a purchase service versus an FTE. But we also communicated that we would need to reduce some FTE by 50. And so this is a year where that trend of reducing staff and then hiring or bringing staff back or adding positions has really had to stop. Like, just given the fact that we entered the 24-25 school year with a missed revenue projection, we had, and the result of negotiations in terms of COLA, we implemented a mid-year budget freeze in January. So there are certain positions that haven't been filled. They were rolled up as a starting point for FTE in the 25-26 budget, but some of those positions are actually open and empty right now. So that plays a part into the actual FTE reduction we're proposing in 25-26. The other way we were able to address the general fund mid-year revision was by most cabinet level directors reduced their discretionary budgets by half for the last 5 months of the fiscal year. So we're currently sitting at 1,314 FTE today in Tigard-Tualatin facilities serving students. Okay, I am going to refer to a different period of time as well. Being new to the district, it's helped provide context when looking at specifically staffing numbers, and that's the school year 2017-18. That's actually the last, that's the year of highest enrollment for Tigard-Tualatin before it started experiencing a decline in enrollment. So we actually started seeing a reduction in enrollment in 18-19 prior to the pandemic. The other thing that at least helps kind of clean out some of the noise when we're looking at funding is integrated guidance or student investment account money wasn't in play in 17-18, nor were ESSER funds, which sometimes when you look at the decisions of the most recent 4 years, federal relief can kind of conflate some of the decision making. So if we're to compare numbers back to 17-18, when we had the most students on record we've had a reduction of 1,700 students, but staffing overall in the proposed 25-26 budget is 75 higher. And we'll come back and look at 17-18 later in the presentation. So now I'm going to shift over to the state school fund. As we know, we have our enrollment, which is students in facilities, and then we have weighted enrollment. The state provides extra funding for students in various, with varying needs. So specifically, students with IEP, we receive additional funding based off of the number of students with IEPs, our number of teen parents or pregnant students, students in poverty, and English language learners. So that's where we'll receive funding for the 25-26 school year based off of a weight of 13,489. That's where if you'd like to refer to this document, this can provide you more detail. Oregon has a no-fault funding clause, which allows districts in declining enrollment to be funded based off of the best of 2 years. So while we're being funded at 13,489 students for next year, that's actually because our current year enrollment is projected to be better than next year's. So we'll receive $11,751 per student, and the state legislature, like I mentioned, currently has $11.36 billion allocated to K-12 education. 25-26 will be the first year of the biennium, and so we'll receive 49% of our total allocation, because the funding formula also knows that things get more expensive with time, and so it gives us an additional 2% in the second year of the biennium. So 11.36 billion definitely sounds like a lot. And yet sometimes when you, well, not sometimes, when you look at where money dedicated to K-12 funding stands as a percentage of the total budget, it has decreased steadily over the last 20 years. So the 25-27 allocation for specifically the state school fund is at 30.2% currently, compared to the high of 44.7% back in 2003-2005. Because of integrated guidance, high school success, and early literacy success, we also start to track other funding sources, which is where we have that red branch break off. But even with that additional funding, resources towards K-12 education are still at 34.3% of the total state budget, which is lower than what the state school fund allocation was just 2 biennia ago. This slide is very similar to what we shared last year. Unfortunately, costs continue to rise. Specifically, when we look at salary and benefits, the last legislative session approved or expanded unemployment benefits for certain school district employees. However, there was no provision of funds to accommodate that additional benefit. In regards to paid family leave, while the employer rate hasn't increased, that was a change in benefits that the district didn't, or the state did not provide districts additional funds to pay for. And what we see correlating with paid family leave is as people use that benefit into their already contracted sick or other types of leave, we're really starting to, or we've been experiencing an increase in substitutes. So it's not only paying the employer rate on the coverage, but also paying for the substitute while that employee is gone. So the other thing I would just point out that we kind of keep getting punched in the gut is our property and liability insurance. So we know with world market and recovery, there are just a lot of significant events driving up property insurance, but then we still have our micro market conditions in Oregon related to wildfire. And so for that reason, we've specifically seen property insurance increase. And once again, that's budgeted at a 20% increase from the prior year. In your budget packet earlier this week, we included a copy of the budget assumptions, which detailed, provided more detail about these items, and those would be available for reference if you'd like more info. I'd be happy to answer questions too. All right, so part two. We are going to talk about, total budget reductions. I believe total 10.9 million, 10.6 of which is being absorbed in the general fund. So we wanted to take an opportunity to talk about our approach in determining which reductions to make. So we'll spend the next couple of slides going over that. Okay, so this is also a table that's detailed in our budget assumptions. And these are one of the ways facing declining enrollment, kind of having most of our federal relief funds no longer available to us, and really at a point where we can't continue to use reserves to sustain operations. We needed to revisit using our class size ratios as guidance for staffing. These ratios have been utilized for the district or by the district for a really long time. The ratios of 1 to 22 for kindergarten or 1 through 29. What I mean to say is these ratios weren't created this year. We've just been able to, and historically though, either use federal funds or operating reserves to intentionally staff below ratio, knowing the needs of students post-pandemic. So again, like I mentioned, without federal funds and not being able to really use reserves, we had to do a pure staffing of using our pre-existing staffing ratio and aligning staffing to those, to what those ratios would prescribe. So yes, we do expect class sizes to increase as a result of that, but they shouldn't exceed the classroom target. They shouldn't exceed our classroom targets. And one of the things I'd like to point out is human resources specifically has an allocation of FTE that's already embedded in your budget numbers that they'll work with building administrators in the fall to allocate staffing to any hotspots that arrive after we have more precise enrollment figures. Another thing which has impacted classes is the use of a lever at the secondary level where extra scrutiny is needed to provide classes that serve fewer than 25 students. That doesn't mean that there won't be any classes of less than 25, but it is requesting that as administrators build their master schedules and look at forecasting data, that if they have a class that's forecasted at less than 25, they specifically talk to their level director and have a second set of eyes, like look at alternatives or solutions. So it could be that a class isn't offered every semester, it's only offered in the spring, but those are some of the things we're asking our building administrators to consider, just so that class sizes in core subjects don't grow to be too high. We do know, though, that there will be classes, like for example, CTE, some of those classes, just because of class size or safety and supervision, need to be under 25. But again, it's just having more people looking at potential schedules to ensure we're operating as effectively as possible while still providing opportunities and choice for students. The other significant portion of looking at reductions was codifying practice into a staffing model. So getting really specific about looking at ratios for administrators and other support staff. While doing that, we considered title schools' needs and requirements. And we also wanted to make sure we were informed of just the current year employment market. It's becoming, we have a much quicker cycle of hiring employees, specifically mid-year, and administrators at the school level play a pretty integral role in that process. Our strategic plan also wants to maintain a commitment to talent development and professional development, and administrators at the schools play a significant role in that work. The other thing, keeping an eye on legislation, is we know that there will be a school accountability measure, which will require administrators time to make sure we're meeting those requirements with fidelity.
So can I interrupt for just a second? I just want to clarify one thing that you said. So we may see more students per class next year as a result of the RIFs we're doing, but it's not because we have changed the staffing ratios. It's that we are enforcing the ratios that we've had for the last 5 years.
Correct, yes. We took the prospective enrollment, applied our pre-existing staffing ratios, and we're able to determine that we didn't need to adjust staffing ratios to make further reductions. So we're sticking to at least our the ratios we've communicated
For years.
for years. Yes.
Thank you.
All right, so I talked about the redesign of systems of support and just wanted to provide a graphical representation of how schools are supported with a tiered intervention model. So this is separated by grade band and shows at what ratio a school might receive a dean or an assistant principal, what percentage of an instructional coach they'd receive, and it also shows counselor ratios and other administrators. And this graphic similarly shows centralized support, specifically TOSAs and instructional coaches. These licensed staff are subject matter experts and are integral in ensuring that our systems are implemented with fidelity at our schools. All right, referring to 2017-18, I wanted to show a difference or show the difference in how staffing by classification has changed. As I mentioned, 17-18 was the year we had the highest student enrollment, and we also didn't have integrated guidance funding at our disposal to take on new initiatives. As you can see, going back to that time, the license group is being reduced by about 25 staff, whereas classified and administrator managers have increased. The factors are listed below. Provide detail as to why those changes are coming into play. We specifically talked about the decline in enrollment, and we also had new sites which required additional classified staff or administrators. Our special education, there was legislation last session which in the workforce bill required a minimum number of hours for instructional assistants serving students with special needs. So for example, if we had an instruction or a learning specialist assistant who was working 3 hours, they're now required to be offered a job of no less than 5.5 hours per day. So that automatically increased their FTE. And we have students with more severe needs, and that's demonstrated in our participation in the high-cost disability program. Unfortunately, that program is capped statewide, so just because our expenses are increasing doesn't mean our reimbursement will increase. It really depends on what's happening statewide. And just as student needs increase, we're finding that even though we're spending more per student, we're actually receiving less in the not total dollars, but just the percentage of coverage is decreasing. And so then, of course, we also have used our articulated investments in our student investment account or our integrated guidance application to add additional staff in all of those areas. We've had questions in the community about changes in administration and the trends there. And so I just wanted to detail why you've seen an increase. Specifically, the student investment account allowed us to increase associate principals at the elementary and middle school level to support tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. And this is specifically important if potentially class sizes increase at the elementary level. This ensures there's another adult in the building to assist teachers when situations warrant it. We also made some programmatic choices. I indicated that Art Rec can open, which required a principal, as well as the virtual academy, but we also made an intentional decision to have athletic directors have administrative licenses. This allows them to hire and discipline employees and also evaluate coaches. And it's just, it's a model that I've experienced at my prior district, making that change. And I feel like most of our colleagues have also made that change in recent years. And then when we look at administration, we have our school level support, which I've talked about, but then we also frankly just have our director levels, our director leaders, and you know, leading up to prior years, we used to have a joint HR and operations director. With the passing of the bond, or at least our 2016 bond, that project was of such magnitude that a director position was created to facilitate that project. And also because of the district's strategic plans, we added an equity leader. And last year, I just wanted to remind, I guess, everyone, or just point out that the director levels actually reduced their teaching and learning director when he retired. That position wasn't replaced. His work was allocated to other people, and the Title III director position was reduced, with that work being redistributed as well. All right. We do always like to do a gut check when making decisions, and did want to look at how our staffing compared to other districts. We specifically pulled data from 6 different districts, and I'll elaborate as to why we picked them. So you'll see specifically we have our neighboring districts of Sherwood, Westland, and Wilsonville, and Lake Oswego. We also, as a larger district, often look to Reynolds and Gresham-Barlow for some comparisons. Gresham-Barlow specifically is helpful because it's a 2 high school district, and that can really impact program design. And then finally, North Clackamas is a larger district, but they have a local option levy, and that is also a lens that we like to look at things through, just knowing that that's a really rich resource for districts, and sometimes it's not equitable to compare a district with a local option levy to one without. So we went through the 25-26 general fund budgets of all of those districts and pulled their FTE amounts, and this is the result of how Tigard-Tualatin compares to those neighboring, or I guess you would say, pseudo-peer districts. So specifically, our licensed ratio is the highest. So we have nearly 55 teachers for every 1,000 students. Classified is little low, despite the significant increases you might have seen since 2017-18. So that's 35 classified employees per 1,000. Managers is little less than the middle. North Clackamas, I just wanted to note, does not code employees to a manager, which is maybe why they're the highest on the administrator side. But at least at the administration level, Tigard-Tualatin is the lowest in that group of 3.6 administrators per 1,000 students. So I've talked about the investment account and how it's played into what positions we're able to provide. And, you know, it's a revenue resource that we're thankful to have. Specifically, when you look at the graph of just total resources allocated to to school districts this biennium. It is worth noting, though, that for the 25-26 year, the district allocation, at least currently slated, it's $11.4 million. And had we been able to retain all of the students we had back in 2017-18, that would provide a resource of $20 million to the district's general fund this year. So while it's a great resource to have, it doesn't make up for the difference we've experienced in having fewer students in our district. All right, so just being really explicit about the impacts on programming. This was summarized in the table in your budget message where you can look at specific FTEs or amounts, but we are reconfiguring our mental health contracts and reducing that expenditure. We will have fewer instructional coaches and teacher on special assignment. Our family partnership advocate model is being centralized, and we'll have fewer deans and assistant principals providing tiered support at the secondary levels. We're also making reductions in FTE, supporting our talent development and colleagues of color program. I just want to expand a little bit on secondary programs because, as we've mentioned, there aren't any reductions in specialists at the elementary level. We're still offering all of our electives. Class size will increase, and we'll use the human resource reserve to address hotspots in the fall. But when you look at secondary programs, specifically at the virtual academy, they, if I understand correctly, they didn't have any incoming sixth graders enroll this year. And so what we've decided to do is that by 26-27, as students progress through grades, the virtual academy will serve 9th through 12th grade only. So next year it will have 8th graders, but then as those 8th graders become 9th graders, we won't be offering a middle school track. That should be compensated by our investment in an alternative ed program at the middle school level, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the virtual academy will also be reducing some of its support. So specifically, a counselor will be shared with Creekside, and a secretary position is being eliminated as part of that consolidation. The use of that lever of really assessing classes offered at less than 25 at the secondary level is nearly impacting any core subject or elective strand. So in prior years, when the secondary programs have been making reductions, the core subjects specifically have been hit really hard. So language arts, social studies, math, and science, with really looking at classes of less than 25. There are electives, there's CTE, some STEM programs. There are varying increments of FTE where classes won't be provided, but that doesn't mean that a program is being eliminated. So you can see the largest impact is in PE and health. Among all of the secondary programs, the equivalent of 4 FTE in PE and health is being reduced. And then there's some smaller segments that are looking at like 1 period of class being like an alternative ed or credit recovery. Those are being reduced. And then finally, extracurricular programs are being maintained, but they're also impacted by the 15% non-payroll reduction. So while there isn't necessarily a specific program that's being reduced, all programs are taking a reduction in budget. And as we've talked about at the school board level this year, our district is the only district that doesn't charge fees for athletic participation. And so, especially given the budget constraints and just the fact that intended outcomes with waiving fees haven't manifested, we've been reviewing and implementing fees which would generate revenue and would help with those, extracurricular programs budget-wise. The budget reconciliation also talks about some of the investments or additions we're making. As we redesign systems, we need to fill or increase some positions. That includes the psychologist, social worker, and the middle school alternative ed program. We also, just following students where they go, need to do some FTE reconciliations according to those ratios for positions like a media coordinator, a custodian, and a secretary at some of our schools. And then we are making an additional investment in our co-teaching ELD program. And ELD is English Language Development. All right, 2/3 of the way there. All right, talk about reserves. So our board policy requires a reserve of 12%. And as I mentioned, starting in 22-23, the board approved, 23-24, the board approved a waiver from that fund balance requirement to maintain current service level. So our operating revenue in the general fund is calculated at $178.7 million. The proposed budget includes a fund balance at the end of 25-26 of 7%. That fulfills the 2% operating contingency requirement, the 5% ending fund balance requirement, but it does not leave any money left for a sustainability reserve. We will use $1.3 million. We'll have a deficit spending of $1.3 million But that's articulated in pages 31 and 32 of the budget message you reviewed. I believe I also have a slide to show that. So we'll jump into detail and an updated graphic, which will match your handout here. But this just shows that the 25-26 budget will use $1.3 million out of reserve. It will end the year at a 7% ending fund balance, but fortunately in 26-27 will stop deficit spending, and while still maintaining a 7% ending fund balance, which is at least better than what we were looking at last year. So really approaching the reductions of making them this year, taking the summer to make sure that those redesigned systems are executed with fidelity, and then just, continuing to operate under that model so that we're not coming every year making additional significant reductions. So this is the forecast, and in your printout you have more notes about the various assumptions, but for revenue, we're calculating this based off of the $11.36 billion state school fund. Given the revenue forecast that occurred earlier this week, we don't anticipate additional funds being approved for the state school fund. The legislature is pretty much on hold, knowing that they might have to respond to federal budget decisions. And so at least talking to our professional associations, we're not expecting more state school fund money. We were also really excited to see traction about increasing that pot for high cost disability, but any hope of that happening was pretty much flamed out earlier this week with the updated revenue forecast. So we at least are relying on the $11.36 billion. We're also showing a moderate increase in local option levy revenue. We experienced quite a bit of compression this year, and so we're trying to be conservative with those estimates moving forward. On the expense side, we will begin negotiating. We're currently negotiating with one of our professional groups, and the other group will pick up negotiations in probably next February. We're budgeting a step and a 2.5, I just make sure, sorry, a 2% COLA. And then expecting other non-payroll increases of a total of 3%. And so we know that some line items like property insurance are more than that, but when you look at the entire pool of non-payroll expenses, we're budgeting a 3% increase. So especially if we look at the 26-27 column, you will see a negative amount. We would need attrition or reductions of about $500,000. And I'm really not 100% confident, but just looking at trends, I think that attrition is most likely what would help balance the budget next year. But 26-27 is where we see the use of deficit spending flip. We actually add $483,000 to the fund balance, and that's required because as operating revenue grows, you need to match that as you apply a percentage to it. So that at least is our 2-year forecast. All right, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about other funds. So specifically, these are the other funds comprising our district budget. For our special revenue funds includes some reserve funds as well as grants, and we're basically budgeting that to be materially consistent. Most of our federal grants, we're assuming flat funding. I'll talk about a couple assumptions here in the next slide, but we do expect an increase in student nutrition and ASB revenue. Debt service is going down. That's solely tied to principal and interest payments. Capital projects is also reducing as the 2016 final bond projects come to a close. All projects are scheduled and there are commitments. It's just a matter of those vendors completing work over the summer and being paid. And internal service funds, the slight increase there just is related to our workers' compensation and unemployment reserve estimates. And the trust and agency fund, which is our scholarship fund, is materially consistent and comparable to the prior year. So I've talked about integrated guidance. These amounts are different than what was published in the March document because ODE revised their estimates. But as you can see, a great opportunity for schools, yet nearly flat funded, and actually in total funding has been reduced. That's specifically challenging when you leverage payroll in these grants and the revenue is not able to keep pace. And again, just related to corporate activity tax collections, which help fund the student investment account specifically. That was a missed projection that was announced earlier this week. So I'm not necessarily expecting a revised student investment account allocation. So what we've budgeted is the most conservative allocation, and that will probably hold true. Just briefly talking about federal funds, we had a lot of questions about the status of federal funds during our community budget work group, which happened to be meeting in February and March when you would turn on your radio and something else had happened related to the Department of Education. So those 3 prior dates are carry forwards from what we talked about our community budget work groups. The most recent development, though, was the release of the president's proposed budget, which is being referred to as the skinny budget, as it refers to the Department of Education. That included a $163 billion reduction to the Department of Education's budget, which is about 1/5. Title II and IV were reduced. Title I was maintained. Title III was eliminated altogether. So really the budget is in Congress's hands, but if they were to pick up and adopt certain themes, that's at least what we have black and white as a proposal. This would, I just want to remind people, this is the fiscal year 2026 budget. So that would affect our 26-27 grants, not our 25-26 school year grants. All right, facilities. So we have a bond measure on the ballot for Tuesday, and I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to speak to the maintenance department and the resources available to them as they manage all of our sites and facilities. So the general fund budget for the maintenance department for the 25-26 school year is $15.6 million. They were also subject to a 15% non-payroll reduction. So that $15.6 million reflects that reduction. When you look at our general fund budget on any given year, we're highly leveraged in staffing on average, about 85 to 87%. As you can see, the ops or maintenance department bucks that trend. They are staffed at about 55%. And in prior years where they had money or like non-payroll money for non-payroll expenditures, in prior years they might be able to do a couple significant, like I say significant, like improvements at school or planned like maintenance projects. In recent years though, and I know it's a song we're kind of tired of hearing, rising costs and tariffs have really dictated how their funds can be spent. So where they used to have a little bit of discretion on what they could do, a lot of their non-payroll costs are for toilet paper, light bulbs, and required inspections, which have actually grown quite significantly. So at least when we look at the general fund, those are the resources at that department's disposal. They do have, our capital project funds do provide some resources. At the board meeting earlier this month, the board updated the construction excise tax rates. Those are taxes that are assessed on new construction within the district boundaries and are available for district improvements or repairs if needed. And when we have an authorized bond, bond funds can be used for the projects that are explicitly listed in the ballot measure and the explanatory statement. So as I mentioned earlier, our 2016 bond is winding down. All of those funds have been committed with projects being completed. And so as we look to next year, we don't currently have a general obligation bond authorized to support new projects. So let's talk a little bit about the bond. I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to remind maybe some of our community members who are listening that the bond measure was made at the recommendation of the district's long-range facility planning committee. This is a committee of approximately 20 members, of which a majority are non-staff who worked for 2 years with the specific charge of representing the entire community to consider current and future generations and develop a plan for facility improvements and make an informed recommendation to the board. That informed recommendation included a scope of projects that a bond measure could cover, as well as a recommended amount of a general obligation measure. So just to highlight what is on the ballot, there are 3 major areas of what bond proceeds, if approved, would support. Our district has historically used bond proceeds to support our 7-year ODE required curriculum adoption cycle. So of the $420.3 million, $20 million is allocated to support 10 annual cycles of $2 million per year. Similarly, student technology and district infrastructure is included. That's a $40 million allocation, and it's supposed to support 10 years of replacement or investment according to our technology plan, which equates to about $4 million per year. We also have our, I like to call them capstone projects. These are our buildings that were built in the 80s, which through the facility assessment had warranted either modernization, or if you're Fowler Middle School, a complete replacement was less expensive than the cost of repairing or renovating. The total of those 5 buildings is $250 million. And then that leaves $111.3 million to address priority 1 and 2 projects. These are items that are imperative to keeping our students safe and warm, and just are tied to building need. They're either end-of-life systems or significant repairs to modernize buildings for 21st century learning. So if we were to take that $111.3 million and divide it over 10 years, which is what the bond construction cycle would be, that provides the district with about $11.13 million a year for those 1 and 2 needs. And so if we, put the capstone projects over here and we add up curriculum, student technology, and our priority 1 and 2 projects, that's an annual need of $17 million. So we're a measure, people have asked me, so if a measure were not to pass, what does that mean for the district? Well, we've built our programming, and Tigard-Tualatin has been a longstanding leader in student technology. So at the very least, for curriculum and adoption, we're reconvening about the 26-27 budget to talk about $6 million. And this is a year where we're reducing general fund by $10.6 million. When we look at what do you do with priority 1 and 2 projects, this is where I go back and look at the resources available to our operations team. We don't have a bond, we won't have a, without a bond measure being passed, we have no authorization or funds to do explicitly named projects. So as a district and board, we need to look at the construction excise tax fund. This fund has about an $8 million budget, and it's accumulated over a couple of years. We receive our construction excise tax receipts. There are certain needs that come up that aren't authorized by bond language, but they're pretty significant, and so we use construction excise tax to help for them. So our 25-26 budget is $8 million. I can tell you we have a project that's on the ballot. It's a proposed project to be covered by the bond. Whether the bond passes or not, that project needs to happen. It's the re-roofing of an elementary school, and it's $2.2 million. So within the course of a year, that construction excise tax is reduced by more than a quarter. So again, I just want to share the implications of the needs and how they, how bond needs interplay with the general fund budget and the decisions we've been making. All right, so that is the official end of the presentation related to the budget message. Here's a highlight of next steps. Would usually open this time for public comment, if there's any, and then the committee can deliberate or ask any questions of district leadership. And then we would ask you to consider approving the budget, including the tax rates and levy amounts. And if the budget is approved tonight, the school board will hold a public hearing on June 9th and adopt the budget at that time. So I will pass it back to Megan.
Do I still read the whole script even if there are no public comments? Okay. So we did not have any requests for public comments. Those were due by 4 p.m. today. So we can move to the next agenda item, which is the budget committee deliberations. We may now discuss the budget. Budget committee members wishing to comment should request to be called upon. I will call on you in order. Are there any questions? Oh. Jimmy?
Yes, I have just a couple of questions, but first I want to pass on some accolades. I am so impressed with the work that Jessica and the rest of the TTSD staff have done. I have sat through my many years through a number of districts, not only here in Tigard, but in Portland, Multnomah ESD, and I have watched the development of these budgets, and I must say I have not seen a budget that has been so thoughtfully put together, that has been so focused on the historical journey that the TTSD has been on in the last 5+ years. I believe this district has stayed true to its values. No one likes to see the loss of staff. No one likes to see the loss of services, especially when staffing and services were all put together at a time when our budget was well endowed, and we were looking at what is it that our children need to become full-fledged, functioning individuals in a community at large. And I want to say that the prior administration, the prior superintendent, other board members really stayed true to establishing these values and gave the current administration and superintendent the road to follow in order to ensure that, one, the community the needs within the community are addressed, and most importantly, the needs of children and families are addressed through this district. Now, that being said, relative to the issue of positions that will be proposed to be reduced, do we know, and I'm sure we do, the number and percentage of positions that are currently vacant and the impact that has on our people walking out of the door, so to speak? Are we looking at attrition issues? Are we looking at just essentially holding off on filling vacant positions? That's one question. And then another one is the 12% reserve fund is an arbitrary rate, as I understand it. I mean, it's a rate that the board came up with. Can you identify for us how that 12% has been so valuable over the last 5+ years? I have my own thoughts about it, but I would like to hear yours.
All right, with the first question, I might ask Director Reed, would you like to come up, or I can bring a mic over? Whatever. I've got a chair. So we'll address the question about vacant positions and how those reconcile to the reduction in force and specific employee separation.
Hello, good evening. So Committee Madam Mayor Brown, currently we are posting some positions, and what you're going to see is a majority of those positions are secondary and partial positions in which members who are on the layoff list are unable to fill. In other words, they don't have the endorsement for that. We currently have approximately 13 positions that you're going to see, and they will be, like I said, partials that are quite able to be put together. We are holding on to about 4 of those positions in which members from the layoff list will be able to fill. So just to give you an idea of where we are at with vacancies and filling those positions.
That's sufficient, great. And I might tap maybe a prior board member to speak to the 12%. Specifically, my understanding of the amount specified in board policy was developed at a time when the state, at the state level, wasn't really doing much in terms of establishing a rainy day fund or a reserve. So out of prudence and foresight, the school board had specifically that stability component of the fund balance. I can say from my prior life and experience in working at other school districts, a minimum 5% fund balance and a contingency, whether it's appropriate to articulate a percentage or a dollar amount, is also a common practice. But my understanding that was most likely devised just based off of the foresight of the state not really doing anything to build up a reserve fund, but the district wanting to be prepared.
Yeah, the state rainy day fund did not exist at the time that the board, which preceded me, put together that 12% number. One of the things that is interesting, and we talked about this when I first came on the board, and the state had by that time approved the state rainy day fund, was we found, okay, maybe we didn't need to have such a large reserve, but then we realized that we have no control over when the state releases the money. So the state currently has something like 28%, I think, in its rainy day fund, and it's not showing any intent of releasing any of that money to schools. So we've come back to the position of, since we don't have any control over what the state does, we get to decide when it's raining with our own rainy day fund. And so that's why we've kept it, I think. I don't want to speak for the rest of the board, but that's been my feeling on it.
Yep, and I would just add to that, you'll see different places, different ranges, but that's between, if you look at OSBA or the state or other entities, they'll kind of say right around, it'd be like 8 to 12, 10 to 12, 7 to 9, like right around that range in terms of what they would say, kind of like our own savings. You want 6 months of, ways to cover costs. And the other piece of that is that 12% is also, there's 3 little buckets within that. So there's the 5%, 5%, and 2% that are all categorized slightly differently that makes that 12%. So that's just a little more context in terms of it's not completely arbitrary, but also to Jill's point that it was created at a time where there was no safety net anywhere else. And as we're seeing now, and even looking to the future, we don't know about federal funds, right? And so we're kind of coming back to this place again where we don't know, there are big question marks. And so having that reserves seems more critically important now. A couple of years ago, a boiler went out right before school started. And so it was imperative that we had money from reserves that we could draw from to do things, kind of emergency repairs and things like that.
The one time that I can remember that we really used our rainy day fund was the year, I think it was 2013, when the state just decided to put off its final payment to school districts until after the fiscal year had ended. And so we essentially found ourselves in 1 month's notice getting 1/12 less money from the state that year. And so we used the rainy day fund to make up that difference. One of the things that I am concerned about after we got the June revenue forecast, and Director C touched on it, but that forecast is down $800 million just from March. If we look at what percentage, if we take that 30% is education, that would mean, I did the math, that would mean $240 million is not coming to education that we were expecting. That correlates to roughly $2.4 million for TTSD next year that's not coming. So if we were to just hold steady, we would need to come up with $2.4 million out of our rainy day fund to close that. We don't have that in our rainy day fund right now at all. So it's very disturbing. And the state has made no indication that they would make up that $240 million out of the state rainy day fund, which is also disturbing.
The other thing I'd like to point out is especially when we are in a position where we have bond authorization and we're selling bonds, Oregon schools repeatedly, just because our funding model is different, but compared to East Coast counterparts of districts of similar sizes, fund balance is a really significant portion of the rating, whether you like it or not. And specifically, we shared with the board, we, at least this fall, were downgraded with a precautionary notice just because of the use of our fund balance and declining enrollment. So while there are very few public school district bonds that actually ever fail because they're backed by the state, rating agencies still look, they frown upon low fund balances. So having a 12% fund balance, especially when it can be built up and when that can be built up and revenue and operating expenses can align, of course, that's the ideal scenario, but that's just more merit for having a higher fund balance.
Did that address all of your questions, Jamie?
I have more.
Okay, all right.
They're easy questions, but yes, that did address both discussions.
All right, thank you. Beth, did you have a question as well?
Go.
I equally want to thank Director C. I'm still learning my new things, and all of the folks who went into creating this budget and for bringing us as new members along in terms of the education in the process. I want to applaud the use of not using reserves anymore to sustain operations and the work to try and rebuild, even if it's in small bits. It's important to use the rainy day fund when there's a rainy day, and it's also important to keep on saving. So I appreciate that very much. I'd also like to, from way back a couple 20 slides ago, when you talked about the comparison data, to point out, I know that there's been some criticism, not within this room necessarily, but of an increased in admin. And if we look at our admin as compared to peer and aspirant districts, how we are still one of the lowest. And so just to point that out and to see how we are on par. So just stating that for the obvious. My question is, I'm curious how, when we look at reductions in FTE as summarized in the table in the budget summary pages, I don't have page numbers. When we look at those reductions in FTE, are they all for one? Is it, when we say it's a reduction of 3.5 FTE, is that three people and a half of one person's job? Is that left up to building administrators? Just curious, as we look at specifically FTE, are we hiring fewer people overall, laying off whole people, giving a reduction of 0.25 to certain people? Just out of curiosity.
Let me see if I can answer the question. So when we're talking about layoffs, yes, there are some FTE that there are part-time folks in that. So when you see 23.75 were laid off, there are folks that were 0.75, 0.5 FTE positions that make up that list. Overall, it's 25 individuals that we have laid off, and then 7 which receive some type of reduction in FTE.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, back to Jimmy.
Sorry. So Let me get to my little list here. So we know that, well, first, because you did do, Jessica, you did bring forward some forecasting around our revenues over time. So do you have a forecast showing improvement in our budget to the point where we can begin to see an increase in the rainy day reserve fund? All things considered, of course.
Sure. Explicitly, no. Our two biggest questions, especially when we look at the general fund, is what is the legislature going to do in terms of state school funding? They have consistently increased the dollar amount of resources allocated to K-12 education, but there's a lot of uncertainty with, again, how the state will compensate for any decreases in federal assistance. Again, the other point for us where some forecasting, it just becomes a little bit more hazy is just because of how highly leveraged we are in staffing. Outcomes of negotiations and what we're able to bargain can impact forecasting. So I can say our district administrators and even our staff have indicated that the last 3 years of constant reductions on paper and then backfilling employees or going through this exercise of making reductions has just been exhausting. And so at least Superintendent Udo Senata and the cabinet have indicated we wanted to make reductions in 1 year and really be future oriented and solutions oriented to kind of break the cycle of continuous reductions. So I would say we want to be good partners with our labor associations because they greatly impact negotiations, and we want to be clear about where we are financially and collaborate with them. But future years, it's really about managing labor costs. And, we already had to start rolling up our sleeves this year with the mid-year budget revision, really scrutinizing any non-payroll cost or additional expense. So we're really just trying to stick to fiscally healthy habits and hope that those flow through to future forecasts.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, if I may, so enrollment has been an issue for our district for a number of years. I saw that we've lost some 1,700 students over time. Mm-hmm. And I know that the loss of those students is multifaceted. I know that the pandemic did something. I know that housing costs, both rental and, single-family dwellings is an issue. I know interest rates are an issue. But I guess part of this is really to superintendent and to our board chair. What strategies are we employing or should we employ with our other municipal partners in the region as it relates to issues of housing costs, the need to ensure that we create not McMansions as the urban growth boundary increases, but that we build the type of housing that allows middle income, lower income, multifamily dwellings to exist in this community. We talk about our values as a community. I've heard the mayor talk about it. I've heard Washington County commissioners talk about it. But I believe that there are strategies that all of those entities, all of those municipalities and school districts can come together around and strategize on ensuring that the schools that we're paying for, that we're building, are being filled with young people that are really going to be our future. And so the way to do that, obviously, is to ensure that we have a housing stock that allows people the opportunity to move into those, as opposed to going to Rooster Poot, Mississippi, because housing is cheaper. Excuse my expression about Mississippi.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think that's a really poignant remark that often gets overlooked. Is one of our essential issues around enrollment has to deal with affordable housing, right? That and birth rates. And some things that we can do, of course, is focus on messaging is important in the community. Be partners wherever we can, especially with any type of urban development with our city and county. And one thing that we can also do is continue to support any incentives around affordable housing developments through tax incentives. And that's something that we've been supportive of historically and will continue to support. We think that we understand that the housing crisis is something that is very real, and it's something that we're eager to support in making sure that we are able to help those who are trying to provide stable housing and affordable housing for our community.
And I would add to that, I think that was so in talking with some of our city partners, there was a shift in the River Terrace 2.0, that it's a very different model than the first set for that very reason, that it was really pricing young families out. The other piece of this is it's almost like another perfect storm where you have declining birth rates, not affordable housing, and you have our boomers that, because of the affordable housing crisis, aren't moving. And so we don't have the houses coming up for sale either. And the ones that do then are way more expensive. And so it is this sort of all of these things kind of happening at once. I will say that with the Tiger Triangle, River Terrace 2.0, there are some developments that are being more thoughtfully considered around being affordable for young families. And then I think our part as a district is to work with the developers, continue working with the city to make sure that people that want to move into this area know how to get plugged in for our pre-K, for our, all the early education pieces, so they're not waiting until maybe they have school-age kiddos first and then kind of figuring out where to go. But it's a complex problem that doesn't have an easy solution, but I feel like there are some things in the works to start trending in a slightly different direction.
And if I can piggyback on that, one of the things that is a really annoying dichotomy for me is that the city of Tualatin has also made inroads into some affordable housing. Unfortunately, that part of the city of Tualatin is not in our school district. The part of Tualatin that is in our school district is pretty much completely built out. So the chances of getting more affordable housing in Tualatin for our district are very slim. The part about the birth rate going down, I always have to smirk a little bit on this one because we're partially to blame for the birth rate going down in our district because we opened health centers in our high schools and our pregnant and parenting student numbers went down. If we were to close those health centers, we could, maybe produce a few more babies, but I don't think we want to do that. That was a joke, everybody.
No,
Just so everybody knows.
Megan, just one more thing, and thank you for the discussion there on potential strategies. The one strategy that I would suggest that we, as we look to talk about building affordable housing, is that we need to be careful of the incentives process, the tax incentives process. Because if we give builders and developers tax incentives to build in the community and provide those incentives around infrastructure issues, those resources that should be coming to the district for cost are held in abeyance for a period of time. It might be 10 years, it might be 20 years, and that's lost revenue to our district. And so I think we have to be very careful on, yes, let's get affordable housing. No, we're not going to give you a 15-year tax abatement so you can build that and make a much larger profit for your organization. And I'm not against profit, but I'm very much against the fact that districts are not receiving the kind of resources that they need because of those developments.
Do we have any other questions or comments? All right, Kristen?
I don't have a question, and I'll explain why in a moment, but I want to acknowledge some things that I saw went into this process and also just in general. I really appreciate the alignment to our strategic plan and to our strategic financial plan, and that's very clear, right? I get the privilege of working all over the state, and I've seen budgets from other districts that it's not clear what is aligned to the strategic plan, and so I really appreciate the work that goes into that. Secondly, I just want to acknowledge that over the course of the year, we've seen staff bring forward proposals for things that are always grant funded, or that classes can be added without cost. And so I want to also acknowledge that throughout the year, we see our staff really trying to do those fiscally sound, like, working within what we've got and bringing forward funding wherever we can get it to do additive things. And that's not easy work. Looking at the slide with the general fund overview and where the reserves as percentage of general funds, I think it was slide 7. I'm really glad we had that 12%, because if we didn't have such a high percentage in 2021, we would have had nowhere to go by now. And then I just want to say that throughout the year, our financial team, and last year too, provides so much information throughout the year that, like, none of this is surprising, right? Like, I'm left with very few, although I was writing down a couple things, and then as I was writing them, you would answer them. So I'm like, you're answering questions as I go. But we are provided so much information as a board and the community through board meetings, that all of this is super transparent as we go. And none of it is a shock when we look at the budget. And so I just really want to thank you and your team for just keeping us updated as we go, and I, as a board member, feel really, really informed. So thank you for all the work that you and your team do.
I would like to echo that sentiment. I appreciate you fielding my questions over the last few weeks and incorporating those answers and the data that I've been asking for into the presentation, because I agree that the community needs to be educated on all of the information that we receive. There's no reason for this to be a gatekeeping situation. So I appreciate the transparency. I appreciate the ability to reach out and ask questions and get clear and complete responses so that we can make an educated decision. And I think that's why there's not as much discussion here today. It's because there's been so much conversation in the months leading up to this that a lot of the questions and concerns have been already addressed. So thank you. Director Jaime?
Yeah, just echo the sentiment of being the transparency and the fact that we get all of the information ahead of time so that we're able to process it, and all of the information that has been shared. I want to also address that, on the slide that you put on here about the bond, that it doesn't bring in any additional revenue to fund FTE, but rather it is just for capital projects and improvements. And so there's some misinformation out in the community for that. And, we got to make sure that right now that we're almost to the finish line of the voting, on the 20th, that we really hit on that point, that it's not about FTE, it's about making or improving the schools for our students. So, yeah, and go out and vote. Thanks.
Okay, I'll say one thing. It's nice not being in charge, but that's not what I was going to say. +1 to the sentiments for the whole financial team. And I think what I think is evident is I think we started these in probably October. And the slides, the numbers, the figures may have shifted because we're humans. And so kids are moving in and kids are moving out and families are changing. But essentially the trends, the big numbers have not changed. And so I think that's a testament to the work that's been continuing to be done in cabinet, in your kind of sphere of what's going on with the superintendent, all of the committee meetings, really talking about drilling down into those numbers and seeing, because I think it would be possible to have conversations 6-7 months ago and then suddenly see a very different budget picture when it's time to do this committee meeting. And instead, while it doesn't mean that the numbers are rosy, it's been very truthful and transparent and honest from the very beginning, while also figuring out how are we going to start troubleshooting this? How are we going to build up reserves? How are we going to start sort of shifting that Viper graph to not be a Viper graph, so that we don't continually have these conversations year over year? And so I think when you're newer to the community, you haven't, right? You wouldn't have any other experience to draw from. But I think the financial team that this district has had for a number of years, kind of Jimmy, to your point, has been stellar. And there has been such a thoughtful sort of fiscal responsibility and sort of like this noble way to really look at it and steward the money that we do have. Is evident in this presentation. So I thank you. And then to the bond point, to underscore, while we do say, right, bonds don't pay for people, the inverse though is that if we don't get the bond, it is paying for things that would have to, in theory, right, the curriculum and the technology, those are things that are pretty critical to our kiddos. And so those things then would come out of our general fund in a different way. And so I think, yes, we separate bonds are for buildings and these things, and no, it won't ever be able to pay for FTE, but the inverse is a slightly different. And I think it's important for voters to know that too, that then we do have a very big chunk of money that would be a critical need that would need to be found somewhere else. And so all the more reason to ensure the bond passes, plus we get the matching grant as well from the state. So that would be another $8 million we would be losing out on. So that's my last bond plug. Go vote.
Kelly?
Jessica and team, I just wanted to also say thank you for educating and putting such thought into this. I know it takes a lot, and it coming from corporate, we take a lot doing our annual budget, so I appreciate it. I do have a question around the fund balance, to Jimmy's point of how do we compare with other school districts at our 7%, and is the 7% sustainable as we look to the future? And if we can't get back to 12, so how do we look at it at staying consistent at 7% and not making sure it doesn't go down below that?
I can say at my prior district, the board adopted a fund balance policy while I was there, and they used recommended language from OSBA that specifically when you look at a model policy, the OSBA policy references the Government Financial Officers Association's recommendations, which are 5 to 8%. So just based off of my personal experience, I can say the 12% is higher than like what you might see in a model policy, but yet then you still have that the bond pressure of having a higher fund balance. Again, that's just recollecting what I've seen. I know that other districts have had experienced their fund balance increasing over COVID just because of those alternative federal funds and not operating facilities and letting vacancies remain open because that position is actually in a school, but we don't have schools open. But I feel like anecdotally talking to our 10K, I call them 10K districts, or districts over 10,000 students. Most of those districts are in significant reduction mode to balance the budget. The only one I've heard that is kind of tapering on is Beaverton, and they expect that to change next year. So that's all anecdotal and should be cross-referenced with Oregonian articles. But thank you. Yeah.
Beth?
I just want to say that as we talk about the budget from such a high level and thinking of doing the fiscally responsible things, and also to the teachers, staff, people who work in the district, and the people who are on the layoff list, that you matter and you are important in making these decisions was not taken lightly without the reference to your livelihood, your purpose, your value. So it's hard sometimes when we're talking at that high level to forget that that is a person and their income and their livelihood, and that we're grateful for that work. But that, as I say in budgeting at my level, there's only so many ways we can split the baby. So.
Does that conclude deliberations for the group?
I would like to make a motion if we can. Okay. I move that the Budget Committee of the Tigard-Tualatin School District 23J, Washington and Clackamas County, Oregon, hereby approve as proposed the budget for the 2025-26 fiscal year in the sum of $302,669,125 for all funds now on file at the Hibbard Administration Office. I further move that the Budget Committee of the Tigard-Tualatin School District 23J, Washington and Clackamas Counties, Oregon, approve the taxes provided for in the proposed budget at the permanent rate of $4.9892 per $1,000 of assessed value for the operations in the amount of $1 per $1,000 of assessed value for local option tax for general school operations in the amount of $22,557,800 for general obligation bonds.
Okay, we'll do a roll call vote. I'm going to go down the list. Oh, sorry. Oh, we need a second. Apologies.
Second the motion as read.
All right. We'll do a roll call vote. Corey Morgan.
Aye.
Jimmy Brown.
Aye.
Beth Dittman.
Aye.
Megan Madlam. Aye. Kelly Cameron.
Aye.
Henry Castillo. Kristen Miles.
Aye.
Jill Zerschnee.
Aye.
Tristan Irvin.
Aye.
David Jaime.
Aye.
Okay. And passed. Oh, did I miss somebody? Yeah.